Good evening. I'm Jensen. I'm an extension agent on Oahu. I take care of edible crops, mostly vegetables, but I do work with fruit trees as well. Tonight, we're going to be talking about vegetable seedling production and then transplanting techniques for these seedlings. So seedling transplants, some of the advantages of producing transplants for production is you get uniformity of seedlings. So in the field, you get establishment and harvest periods are pretty much timed because you're not waiting on germination out in the field with direct seeding. You get seeding vigor, and then typically you can reduce the amount of time in the field because you can put the seeds in a tray in a nursery that's a smaller footprint before putting out in the field, and you can accelerate that process in that nursery and then get it out into the field. And you're not wasting seed out in the field that hasn't germinated or space out in the field for seeds that haven't germinated. So there's some benefits to producing seedlings. Some of the disadvantages is you're going to need an extra nursery area, nursery space to provide a good climate for these seedlings, and then added materials to build the benches, the irrigation system, and all these other things that go into producing seedlings for your transplants. So one of the first things you are probably doing already for your production is seed sourcing. So what types of seed should you use? Do you need disease resistance for the type of crop you're growing? Are there cheaper sources for the seeds that you want to grow? Is there ease of planting for a certain type of seed coating or other treatments to the seed? What is the quality of the seed that you're buying from these seed companies? Do you want to be organic or conventional? Are you okay with GMO seeds or genetically engineered seeds? And then should you produce your own seeds? Should you make your own hybrids? Should you collect seeds from open pollinated varieties? These are questions to think about when sourcing your seeds. And so when you're talking about different types of seeds, I mentioned ease of planting, and one of the ways to increase the ease of planting is to buy pelleted seeds. There's both conventional and organically approved pelleted technology. And so the image to the right shows what a pelleted seed would look like. And so, excuse me, this could be a lettuce seed inside this capsule. And once you put it in the seeding tray, it provides moisture holding capacity and other benefits that help germination processes and stuff like that. One of the downsides is that there's an added cost, but this can also help with mechanization of transplanting or seeding directly into the trays or in the field if you choose to do that instead. And then they're uniform in size, and so it makes it a lot easier for these machines to seed the trays or however you're producing your seedlings. And then selecting the right variety, there's all kinds of varieties. Both Josh and I and our other colleagues do a lot of variety trials for different crops. And so we have institutional knowledge of what varieties typically do well in our geographic locations. And so we can help make recommendations. If you have a certain crop that's not doing well, we can make recommendations on maybe you might want to add a variety that has this disease package, or it's slower to bolt in a hotter climate, or has a more compact characteristic that's more conducive to your production area. We can help make suggestions or work with you to do variety trials on your property or on our research facilities to find better varieties for your production. And then seed treatment can be beneficial. So a lot of times we would treat seeds for disease prevention. And so one of the common diseases in a seedling production area or even in the field is damping off. And so some of these fungicides that are treated onto the seed or placed onto the seed before transplanting, either at the factory or you can do some of it yourself, can help to increase germination and also survivability of your seedlings inside the nursery trays. But this includes an added cost, which may or may not be profitable for your operation. So these are some of the economics you want to think about when you're buying your seeds. So I talked about doing your own seed treatment. So there's some techniques out there that you can use. And so hot water treatment can be used to treat for diseases on seed coats. There's also bleach and peroxyacetic acid, and definitely important if you're doing some of these treatments, make sure you're following the label for the amounts and some of the other regulations that you have to comply with when using these products. And also, if you're an organically certified operation, make sure your certifier is okay with the treatments that you're using. If you have older seeds, this may be more common. Doing germination tests can help you determine the quality of your seed, and then the viability, so you're not wasting. If you have old seed, you want to make sure they're pretty good germination, so you're not wasting seeding trays or space in your nursery. And so the way you would do a germination test, a common way is to select a sample, something like 100 seeds or 50 seeds, place them on a moist paper towel, or sand or soil, like potting soil, and then keep them under controlled conditions, whether it's temperature, light, moisture, and then observe them for a couple of days. And then after you've done that, count how many seeds have germinated, and that's going to give you your percent germination rate. And then, so something like an 80% germination rate might be pretty good. But if you're getting down to like 50% germination rate, this is also something to know. Like in the seedling tray, maybe I have to put twice as many seed because I have 50% germination. And so that way you can maximize the amount of seedling you have per tray. And then once you've got your seeds, deciding what seedling media to use. And so a standard grower practice is probably a sunshine mix. So that bag on the right, the image on the right is a blend of peat and perlite. And there's all different brands. Sunshine mix. There's also other blends that you can make on your own. You can buy the peat yourself and the perlite yourself and mix them on your own. There's also fungicide treatments for some of these mixes to help with disease pressure inside the nursery. An alternative to peat is coco coir. So there's a few suppliers on island that produce or that distribute coco coir based media that you can mix with your own perlite to develop your own seeding blends. And there's all kinds of other blends out there. These are just some of the common materials being used for seedling medias. The main thing you want to make sure is you have good drainage and good moisture holding capacity. These two things are going to help with the success and production of your seedlings. An alternative to that is something like Oasis or Rockwool is another alternative. These are single-use plugs. They have really good holding capacity, really good aeration, really good drainage. They are really expensive compared to peat perlite, but they can increase the ease of planting, and they're typically used for hydroponic seedling production because these Oasis cubes are almost exclusively used for NFT systems. But you can also use them for infield production. But I generally don't recommend it just because of the cost. And then another component that I typically recommend is adding amendments to your seedling media because the media that you're using is typically inert. There's no nutritive value to the media that you're using. And so you're not really going to get any nutrients supplied to the plant unless you're adding it separately. And so one of the ways you can do that is to mix it within the seedling media to make it plant available inside that media. Another option is to do it post seeding after germination. You can come back in and foliar or soil drench some of your nutrients in there. But some of the pre-plant media amendments that you could typically use is tankage. So this is a meat bone meal product from Island Commodities. Um, you might want to check the ratios because some of these can be very hot. Hot meaning it has a lot of ammonia, it can burn the seeds, burn the seedlings, and so putting too much of it, or even putting it too early, or using it too quickly, meaning if you put it in and put your seedling in, it can typically burn the seed or the seedling, and so you might want to mix it in advance, wet the soil to have it kind of break down and release some of that ammonia gas to reduce the heat of that particular product. Another option is compost. There's Hawaiian Earth is an example of compost. There's other companies that produce compost commercially that you can use. Sustain is an option. Bioflora is an option. Vermicast is a really good option, but it's hard to find good quality vermicompost unless you're producing it yourself. And for me anyway, for my seedling production, I typically use a commercial slow release fertilizer like Osmocote or Nutricote. And I'll show you some data, some of the trials that we've done utilizing these slow release fertilizers. And then usually post germination, you would use a soluble fertilizer like Peter's Triple 20 or a fish emulsion or some product like that to increase the nutrient content of your media to produce better seedlings. And so this is an example of a vermicompost trial. that was done a while back. And so different rates of vermicompost to seedling media can help increase the vigor of your seedlings. And so you can see the 100% is way better than just using peat perlite mixed with liquid fertilizer. But 75% vermicompost and maybe even 50% is equivalent to utilizing the liquid fertilizer post germination. And so that might be a rate that you might want to go at is 50% or 75% to save money on the cost of vermicompost. But like I said, I typically use Nutricote in my seedling blends, and so I wanted to see what rate we should put the amount of Nutricote into the seedling blend. And so I chose 10%, 5%, 2.5%, 1%, and 0.5, 0.5% and 0% Nutricote by volume. And so a 10% by volume would be like 9 cups of media to 1 cup of Nutricote, mix that in, and then these are all planted at the same time, germinated at the same time, and this is the growth, kind of the growth curve based on the rate. And so, typically, I've been recommending a 2.5% by volume ratio to get adequate growth without putting too much fertilizer because Nutricote can be a little bit costly, and so you don't want to be wasting fertilizer if you don't need it on the field. One of the benefits to Nutricote is that it can have a up to 160-day release. And so by putting the fertilizer in this media and you're transplanting these seedlings later in the field, you have an additional release of fertilizer out in the field directly to that seedling to help with establishment and quicker uptake of or growth in the field after transplant. This is another trial I did. So this is 3 weeks after seeding, and you can see some of the different blends. Starting from the left, you have a liquid fertilizer mixed with a sunshine mix, Peter's triple 20 at a tablespoon per gallon. And you can see that's the grower standard. And so every week from germination, you would come back in and drench in the seedling media as well as over the top of the seedlings to provide them with fertility. We did fish emulsion, which didn't seem to work that great in this particular trial when we were doing foliar drenching. It could have been the fish emulsion that we're using wasn't that great. And then the third one is our Sunshine and Nutricote blend. And then we changed to different media, which was the straight cocoa peat with Nutricote, and they were about the same. And then the vermicast trial you see here was a poor quality vermicompost. And so I mentioned getting access to good, high quality vermicompost can be challenging unless you're producing your own because we don't really have good sources on island in large quantities. And so vermicompost that we used, but this one was a mainland product brought in, and it didn't really have the nutrient value that the one that we used in the previous trial had. And then tankage, we went at a lower rate just to make sure we didn't burn it. So you can see that one. And then in this particular trial, we were partnering with Kaimuki Middle School, who gave us their compost to test out. And then we use a bag product from New Valley, which is a local company distributing this compost. And then during this trial, working with Go Farm, they gave us their blend, and this is the results that I got out of that trial based on what we were doing. And this is the same example, just with a different crop, which was cabbage versus the lettuce. But each one was about 3 weeks after we seeded. So you can see that the Nutricote and the Sunshine mixed with the triple 20 stood out as making seedlings ready for transplant a lot faster. And you can see the density of the root ball. This makes establishment in the field a lot better. Survivability increases. Or the ability to pull these out of the seedling trays increase. And so having the right nutrition in your seedling medias can increase your production because you're having higher quality seedlings going out into the field. And one important thing is to put labels on your trays so you can keep track of the variety names. If you're putting lot numbers or field numbers for food safety purposes, this helps you with traceability from the nursery out to the field. Dates help you understand when it was seeded and when it needs to go out into the field. And then if you have a larger operation, knowing who planted it can be important too. So maybe there's a germination issue, you can go back to the seeder to figure out why you're getting poor germination and maybe do an educational training with that particular planter person planting to make sure that they understand the right protocols for your operation. So labels can help with tracking a lot of this information. And then if there's a junk variety, you have traceability out in the field too, knowing what variety you put in the ground. And maybe it's susceptible to a disease. It all starts from this seedling stage. And then once you got all that set up, the seeds you want, the media you're going to use, then it's deciding how big of a seedling tray you want to use for the crop that you're growing. And so there's all kinds of different sizes, different materials of seedling trays. So that first one on the left is a 72 plug seedling tray. It's made out of styrofoam. It lasts kind of a long time as long as you don't chip it or break it. It's a V-shaped cell, and so it's easy to pull the seedlings out of the tray. Makes it a lot easier. The second one on the right in the middle is a 128 plug tray. It's a little bit smaller. You get a lot more cells per square footage, and so the number of seedlings can increase. And so this would be perfect for something like cabbages, lettuces, pak choys, and stuff of that smaller size. But I've seen operations use something like this for even larger plants like tomatoes, cucumbers. It just depends on how you're going to utilize that seedling after and the skill set of the transplanter. And something like a 72 plug tray is for those larger crops like eggplant, tomatoes, um, cucumbers and stuff like melons and stuff like that. And then the one on the right is a 288 cell tray. And those are typically for really small seedlings. And so for me, my experience is I've only used it with onion seedlings, whether it's green onion or bulb onion seedlings. And because of the small cell size and the small root system that these seedlings have, it's kind of perfect. By the time it's ready to transplant, they haven't taken up too much of the above ground space. And because they're upright growing leaves, they don't have to fight for sunlight. And so it makes a really good um, maximization of space on the nursery benches. And so these are some of the things to think about when you're buying trays, how much seedlings you need, what does your nursery space look like? And then is the quality of seedlings from this size cell adequate for your ability to transplant out in the field? And then if you don't want to use trays like plastic-based trays, which um, there's an option called soil blocking. And so soil blocking uses this mechanism, equipment piece here in the middle. It's basically you develop a seedling blend, you put it in a wheelbarrow, you take this blocker, it basically fills up these cells with media. And typically you have a wood-based tray similar to this, and then you place these blocks, you press them out with this machine or this contraption out onto this wood-based um, nursery tray, I guess you can call it. And then from there, it'll have holes for you to plant into. I think for me, one of the challenges that I had with this particular technique is that the seedling from this cell will grow into that cell. And so when you're taking them apart, you might be damaging some of that root system and putting them into shock. And so those are some of the things to think about, but it does eliminate the need for plastic-based seedling trays. Once you've selected your trays, the next step is, and you mixed your media, the next step is to fill your trays with media and then use a dibble. A dibble is just something that's going to make holes in the media so that you can place your seeds. This is a homemade version that I built using electrical wire um, caps. And so you just basically, what I did was I measured the seedling tray um, by putting the seedling tray on this piece of wood, and then each seedling tray has a drainage hole. And so in that drainage hole, I used the Sharpie and I made marks down the board. And then I drilled in screws on the backside and then twisted on each of these caps onto the screw. And then it makes a perfect dibble so that all you have to do is you take this piece of wood with the caps on them and then line them up with each cell. place them on, push it in lightly till it hits the top of the tray, and then pull it off. And then you have these nice, perfectly aligned dibble holes that you can place an individual seed into. You don't have to use something like this. I've used this just for demonstration purposes. I typically just use my fingers and then poke holes in it with my fingers to a depth that I prefer. Um, and smaller, more sensitive seeds, you want a shallower depth. Something like lettuce, you want a shallower depth. And then some of the bigger, hardier seeds, you might have to get a bigger depth, like cucumber or melons would require a deeper depth just because it's a larger seed as well. Some seeding methods, there's hand seeders, vacuum seeders, drop seeders, and other mechanical seeders. And so this image here on the right is like a vacuum-based seeder. Uh, on the top here, there's a collection of seed. On the wand, each little needle here can suck up a seed from this, and it's spaced to the cell tray. And then there's usually a release valve, which is probably here that you can stop the suction and it'll drop the seed into it. And that way you don't have to drop an individual seed into each cell. But there's other tools, cheap tools that you can use to hand seed. Um, the challenge with hand seeding, though, it can be time consuming because you're trying to put an individual seed into each individual cell. And so that can take a bunch of time and might be costly for labor to do it that way versus investing in an equipment that can do it a lot faster over time. And so some of the more efficient ways to seed, especially if you have uniform seeds that are pelleted, these include drop seeders or vacuum seeders. These can be homemade. So the right here on the right is a homemade drop seed, vacuum seeder. And so there's a plexiglass here, and this is a chamber, a plywood chamber that you can build. And all it does is hold air. It doesn't really need to be this large, but it has to be able to fit your shop vac so you create suction. And then what you would do here is you sprinkle all your seeds onto this platform and then roll it around till you fill each hole with a seed. Once you have that filled, then you pour out the rest of the seeds that are left on the tray back into your bowl or bag of seed. And then you would flip this over onto the seedling tray. It should be lined up with the rim of the seedling tray perfectly so that it drops perfectly into each cell. And then once you flipped it over, you turn off the vacuum and you can typically pound the back end of it. And then all the seeds should drop into your dibble holes. And then once that's completed, then you can grab a little bit of more media and then cover lightly over the top. And that should be complete for planting. This is a larger operation. And so this is the seedling trays will actually roll on this conveyor underneath this drop seeder. And it'll drop a seed across the line of cells as it's passing through. And then I'll talk a little bit of dormancy later on, but lettuce typically likes cool temperatures for the first couple days to a week of germination. And so if you can see the air conditioning in the background, this is actually a garage converted into a seedling operation. And so these trays are actually on this conveyor inside the garage for the first week to allow for better germination. And then as they germinate and develop, it actually goes out in sequence. And so the end gets planted. And then these trays follow sequentially after that particular tray and goes out to the field. Another technique for planting is compots or community pots. And it saves time, I think, for making sure that you get germination of your seeds and then placing individual seeds in a cell. And so this one you can see is this is mamaki. This is how I propagate mamaki seeds. And so I usually fill a tray with perlite or vermiculite, and I take an individual seed and I just smash it into the perlite. And then about 2 weeks later, you have seedlings germinate in the community per cell. And then I take these out of the community and I split them up. And um, papaya is another common one that I've seen or heard other operations do for their operation. And so you can separate this pot and then put individual seedlings into a seedling tray or into another pot. to up pot them. And so up potting would be taking that individual community pot or seedlings from that community cell and then gently taking them apart, not to rip the roots, and then placing them into their own individual cell to establish a better root system. And then from there, you can up pot them one more time to like a 6-inch or a 1-gallon pot to let them develop into what you would take out to the field, or if you're going to sell seedlings from your nursery to clientele, that's another option. But that's one way to scale up your or minimize the size of your operation so you can get better germination instead of wasting pots for them to germinate. And something like Mamaki, the seeds are so small that there's no way you would get an individual seedling per pot if you were to do it that way. So community pots help with really tiny seeds to help germinate them up and allow them to be split and put into individual pots following that germination. And then in the nursery, there's a bunch of seedling issues that's going to come up, and each operation is different, but it's going to happen, and it's something that you're going to have to deal with as it goes on, figuring out why it's doing what it's doing. And so the image on the left, um, they installed a new irrigation system, and that irrigation system wasn't really covering as well as their previous irrigation system. And so making sure you have good coverage of water is important too, so that you don't get seedlings drying out in the center of your bed, and then that just decrease your seedling availability for your field by half, which decreases your production by half. And so um, you want to make sure you have a good nursery operation to make sure that you always have good, high quality, consistent seedlings going out to the field. And then pest management is going to be an issue too in your nursery. It's a high humidity situation. It's if you're fertilizing them heavily, that's going to be very nutritious for other insects to come in and feed on. And so pest management is important in your nursery. And spraying can help to minimize some of these diseases. And one of the important things is you don't want to take your pest pressure from your nursery out to the field and already set your operation back because you've taken a disease or an insect out to the field, and now it's in the field established and it's just spreading through the whole field and potentially wiping out your whole crop. And so there are products you can use to control fungal diseases as well as insect pressure in your nursery. And if you do have questions on certain pests, we can either answer it today, or you can always contact an extension agent to help you figure out the best option for your production system. And I mentioned seed dormancy. So some seeds have a dormancy that you need to overcome for them to germinate. And so some of the common seed dormancies include physical dormancy, which could be something like a hard seed coat, which can prevent water uptake and oxygen for germination. And so this would require scarification or a physical scratching of the seed to make sure that you can scratch through that hard coating so that you create this permeable coat so that water can move through and the seedling can um, germinate through that hard seed coat. There's a physiological dormancy. This could be some kind of internal chemical factor that's inhibiting that germination. And so you may have to um, treat the seed some other way physiologically to break that dormancy. And then you have morphological dormancy. And so the embryo inside just might not be fully developed and so won't germinate. And then combinational dormancy, which is a mix of physical and physiological dormancy. And so one of the common seeds that I work with is papaya that has this sac, I guess, around the seed, the actual seed, and that sac can prevent germination. And so if you're saving seed, you want to make sure you're removing this outer sac, the gelatin material that's on the papaya seed. That should increase your germination significantly. Another option with papaya seeds specifically is to soak them in like a potassium nitrate solution to help break that dormancy. And I believe there's a CTAHR pub on how to make that concentration of potassium nitrate to help break dormancy. Or if you want, I can help find that publication and give you the ratio of water to fertilizer and how long you have to soak it to help break some of that dormancy. And then priming is another technique to increase germination and seedling vigor. I don't think it's a huge common thing with vegetable growers here in Hawaii, but I know seed companies on the mainland and around the world do this to increase their productivity. And so some of the benefits of seed priming, you get faster and more uniform germination, better seedling vigor. You can get improved tolerances to stresses like drought, salinity, and temperature. You could potentially get higher crop yields and then more efficient use of the seed that you're buying. Seeds are expensive, so you want to maximize um, all of the seeds that you have in your possession. And then some of the types of priming out there, hydro priming, and so that's just basically soaking water or soaking your seeds in just water. Um, there's osmo priming, so soaking in a solution like PGs or salts to control water uptake. And then halo priming, soaking them in the salt solution, hormonal priming, using plant growth regulators like gibberellins to help break dormancies, and then biopriming, using like beneficial microbes to help increase germination and seedling vigor. And so, um, some of the ways you can do this is not directly before seeding your seeds. So one technique is to do the priming, and then there's a drying process. And then after that drying process, you can actually hold on to that seed for a certain amount of time before actually using them in your nursery or your germination process. And that makes it beneficial. So you can do larger batches at one time and then hold on to that seed in your refrigerator or wherever you're holding them before actually putting them out into your nursery. And then examples of nursery setups. Typically, you want them off the ground and you want some rigid bench to put them on. And so in this case, we're using this expanded metal product, and then we're using old school irrigation pipes from overhead irrigation from, um, I don't even know where we got them from, but they're probably from pineapple days or sugarcane days. And then others have used just regular galvanized pipe to make their nursery benches. They also do sell and manufacture um, PVC base benches, and then you can use regular PVC legs for those benches. And they have a pretty good lifespan for those nurseries. And then size of your nursery, how much seedlings you need for your crop rotations. You want to make sure you scale your nursery large enough to accommodate all the seedlings you need for your crop rotation. And then most commonly, overhead irrigation is used for your seedling operation. And so you can see we put it down the middle, other growers put it on the edges. And it all depends on your coverage that you need for your nursery. And then timing of irrigation can also help. So putting on a timer, making sure that your seedlings are getting watered to keep them hydrated, but also not and to make sure that they're not drying out, but you don't want to be overwatering them. And so putting on a timer on your nursery can help with alleviating some of that, knowing what your weather patterns are in your area. And then once your seedlings have matured and they're ready to go out to the field, one of the more important steps before transplanting is to make sure you harden them off. And so hardening off is just a process of basically gradually getting them from an indoor nursery setting, which is like the high humidity, minimum light situation. It's ideal for them. And then taking them out and slowly introducing them to harsher conditions. So either cutting back on your irrigation schedule, taking back some of the screen shade that you have on your nursery if you do have them. Um, and that will help to basically harden the tissue so they're not so sensitive. And that way, when you put them on the field, you reduce the amount of shock that they're going to incur while being transplanted, especially if it's on a hot, sunny day that you're transplanting. And then now we're getting into transplanting. And so understanding, um, well, first is making sure that your field is prepped adequately for transplanting. So um, doing the bed prep if you're making beds, doing the tillage if you're doing tillage, making sure it's soft enough to plant, incorporating all your amendments that you need to amend with prior to transplanting. And so once all that's out, um, we typically put out our irrigation system prior to transplanting so that we're ready to turn the water on um, when we transplant. other farmers like to run the irrigation prior, so they do a pre-wetting, and what that does is some of these soils might be really dry, and so they will actually pull moisture out of the seedling root ball and actually um, traumatize them a little bit, shock them a little bit. And so some growers like to wet the field prior to transplanting just to get them a little bit moist so that you can reduce some of that drought or shock with that water pulling out of the seedling ball. Me personally, I think it can be harder to transplant if the soil is too muddy, and so making sure you time it right so that it's dried out a little bit where it's not super muddy that you can't put the seedlings in the ground and dealing with like clumpy mud on your transplanting equipment. But then decide your spacing either within the row and then what your row spacing is going to be before you transplant. And then if you're doing it by hand, making sure that you have something like a ruler so you can um, space them out adequately so they're not overcrowding each other or you're not wasting space on the field. So this is just general recommendations for a few different crops. And so something like lettuce and cucumber are probably one of the faster germinating seeds and mature in the nursery quicker. So about 3 to 6 weeks and 3 to 4 weeks for cucumber. Um, before they're ready to go out into the field. Tomatoes, cabbage, peppers, they're about 4 to 6 weeks before they're ready to go out into the field from seeding. And then onions take a little bit longer from 8 to 10 weeks. And these are just some general spacing that you could use for transplanting if you're not already doing so. And so something like 6 to 8 inches within the row and maybe 10 to 12 inches down the row, between the rows, you would use for lettuce. And then something like trellis tomatoes, you would use an 18 to 24-inch spacing between plants on the row. And then each row, each trellis would be about 3 to 4 feet apart. Cabbage is about 12 to 24 inches apart down the row. And then each row is about 24 to 36 inches, depending on how you're planting it and the size of the head that you're trying to develop on your cabbage. Peppers is pretty similar to tomatoes. Cucumbers is pretty similar to tomatoes. And then onions, you're looking about 4 to 6 inches between each plant and maybe 12 to 18 inches between each row. And then once you've got um, your spacing all set up, it's now going to transplanting. So different tools you can use for transplanting. For a small research operation like us, we use something like these two on the left. This is just a regular trial, and then the one on the left is a old school pineapple planter. I personally love that pineapple planter. It makes it really easy to transplant. Um, if you're using plastic mulch on your bed, it also helps with piercing through the plastic mulch to plant your seedlings through the plastic mulch. And um, sorry, uh, this video doesn't look like it's gonna work, but this was a video to show. So what I do is I stick the trowel into the soft soil to a depth that I want my seedlings to be at. And then once you've stuck it in there, you push it forward. You're gonna create a hole. And then you take your seedling, put it in that hole you created, and then as you're pulling the spade out of the ground, you hold that seedling in place, and then you come back in and you can backfill that hole that you've made or left with loose soil that's around the area. And then something like Johnny's Seed Company has something like these for sale. You can drop your seedling down this shaft, and there's a door at the bottom of this, and so you would tilt it, open the door, it'll let the seedling out into the hole that you made, and you lift it up as you're doing this, and that'll help keep the seedling there. For me, the challenge with this is where do you hold the rest of your seedlings? And so are you bending down to pick up a seedling that was on the ground with the spacing you need? Or is there somebody driving next to you that has a tray of seedlings? And so I typically haven't used this product. I usually use the hand trowel. But if you want to go a mechanized route, there's a whole bunch of auto transplanters out there. These are some of the ones that I've seen out in the field or at equipment shows. And so you can have a single transplanter with two seats. So you have two workers here pulling seedlings out of the tray and then dropping it into a shaft similar to this one. And basically, as it's going, this wheel is pressing the seedlings into the ground and then placing it in there for you. This is another one. There's an individual seat on the backside of each one of these. The cool thing is this whole thing rotates, so you can have up to 4 trays at a time, and all you're doing is pulling seedlings out of each tray and dropping it in. This one has a revolving hole, which I don't know if I have another image of. But from here, you can see these yellow holes is where you would drop the seedlings, and as the tractor is pulling this equipment, it's rolling these wheels to drive the ceiling to drop in the hole, and this revolver to actually move around. So you just preload the revolver similar to this one. And as it hits this hole, it'll drop it down the shaft into the hole. And usually there's um, a mechanism to make a trench in the field, and the ceiling is dropped, and then these discs will actually also help cover that trench that you've made. And that's a quick overview of seedling production and as